In the first part, we asked how fiction warps reality. In the second, we asked whether fiction can become reality. But there's a question we've been circling around without naming. What happens when fiction and reality are no longer separate? Because at a certain point, this stops being about stories, characters, or imagination. It stops being about influence. It becomes about structure, about what the brain does when it is exposed repeatedly and consistently to narratives that feel meaningful, emotional, and complete. The unsettling truth is this: fiction doesn't need to convince you of anything. It only needs to be repeated, slowly, quietly, without resistance. The brain adapts. Emotional responses loop back on themselves. Fear becomes ambient. Identity begins to borrow. Morality starts to justify itself through coherence rather than instinct. And eventually, reality itself becomes harder to process. Not because it is false, but because it no longer fits. By the time this happens, nothing feels wrong. In fact, everything feels clearer. This is no longer about imagination. It's about reconstruction. Hello everyone, I am Challengato and this is the final chapter. Log Code 12. Fiction rewrites reality. As with earlier parts, the chapters for this video are listed in the description. You can skip to any section, but I strongly recommend watching this video in sequence. The ideas are tightly connected and each part depends on the previous one. Fear is rarely born loud. It doesn't arrive with screams, alarms, or obvious trauma. That's the version we recognize and therefore defend against. Real fear is quieter. It enters the mind the way moisture enters concrete, invisibly, slowly, and long before the structure shows cracks. By the time you notice it, the damage is already structural. Phobic Micro-Induction is not about terror. It's about training. The human brain does not need a direct threat to learn fear. It only needs repetition, association, timing. When fiction introduces in fragments, short scenes, passing imagery, background tension, the amygdala activates without the cortex ever fully engaging. There is no conscious evaluation, no internal debate, just the subtle neural note that says, remember this feeling. And the brain does. Each exposure is small enough to be dismissed, too small to question, too brief to process. But together, they accumulate. A shadow in the background of a scene, a sound cue that precedes something bad, even when nothing happens. A pattern where uncertainty always resolves into threat. Over time, the brain begins to predict fear before it occurs. This is the critical shift. At this stage, fiction is no longer depicting danger, it is installing threat anticipation. The mind starts filling gaps on its own. Silence becomes suspicious. Neutral spaces feel loaded. Stillness feels unsafe. What's important here is that nothing needs to happen. The fear response activates in the absence of stimulus. This is micro-induction. Unlike trauma, which overwhelms the nervous system, micro-induction conditions it. The brain learns that vigilance is safer than calm, that anticipation is preferable to rest. Over time, the baseline emotional state drifts from neutrality to guardedness. Once fear becomes the default setting, perception changes. The world starts feeling slightly off. Not hostile, not dangerous, just unstable. Like something is always about to go wrong, even when logic says otherwise. This is where fiction's influence becomes invisible. Because the mind is no longer associating fear with stories, it is associating the reality with fear. At this stage, the prefrontal cortex often rationalizes the fear after the fact. It invents explanations, news, social delays, human nature, personal intuition, anything to justify a feeling that was never consciously chosen. The individual believes that they are perceptive. In reality, they are conditioned. Neurochemically, this state is maintained by low level cortisol elevation, paired with intermittent dopamine release. Fear becomes stimulating, tension becomes engaging, calm starts to feel empty, even uncomfortable. This is why some people seek darker fiction, not for thrill, but for regulation. Fear becomes familiar, familiar becomes safe. But there's a cost. Once threat perception is skewed, the brain begins misfiring outside fiction. Social interactions feel charged, ambiguity feels dangerous, neutral expressions are read as hostile, silence is interpreted as judgment. The world around you hasn't changed, the filter has. Phobic micro-induction doesn't make you afraid of something, it makes you afraid. Full stop. And the most dangerous part, because it never arrives as a single event, the mind never flags it as damage. There's no moment to point to, no origin story, no clear cause, only a quiet persistent sense that safety is temporary and vigilance is wisdom. By the time you realize fear has moved in, it already feels like it belongs there and you never even realize it. At some point, fiction stops being about something we observe. It becomes something we reference. Parasocial identity scripts emerge when prolonged exposure to fictional characters, narratives, or personas begins to influence how the mind models itself, not consciously and not immediately, but gradually through repetition and familiarity. The human brain is exceptionally good at simulating other minds. We do it instinctively. We imagine what others think, how they might react, what they might say. Fiction takes advantage of this ability by offering minds that are stable, coherent, and emotionally legible. Characters who know what they stand for, who respond decisively, who embody clarity in moments of chaos. Over time, these simulated identities don't remain external, they linger. The brain begins to borrow from them, not as imitation, but as reference material. How would they handle this? What would they say? What would this moment mean in a story? This is where the shift begins. Parasocial attachment is often described as emotional closeness to fictional figures. Parasocial identity scripts go further. They don't just create attachment, they create templates, scripts for confidence, scripts for morality, scripts for suffering, scripts for meaning. The danger isn't that these scripts exist, it's that they begin to substitute the slower, messier process of self-formation. Real identity develops through uncertainty, contradiction, and lived consequence. Fictional identity, by contrast, is already resolved. Motivations are clear, arcs are complete, growth is narratively justified. When the mind repeatedly engages with these resolved identities, it begins to experience something subtle but profound: identity lag. The internal sense of self stops, keeping pace with external decisions. Instead of acting first and understanding later, the mind hesitates, searching for a script that feels appropriate, not because the individual lacks agency, but because agency has been outsourced. This is often experienced as inspiration, reliability, or resonance. But beneath this surface is a quiet delay between impulse and ownership. A pause where the question is not what do I want, but what makes sense here. This is not mimicry, it's internalization. Over time, the boundary between self-generated identity and narrative-derived identity begins to blur. Certain emotions feel more authentic when they resemble familiar story beats. Certain reactions feel right because they align with the internalized character arc. Life begins to feel more real when it resembles fiction. This is where parasocial identity scripts become difficult to detect. They don't erase the self, they scaffold it. They provide structure where ambiguity exists, clarity where uncertainty would otherwise remain. And because they offer coherence, they feel helpful. But coherence is not the same as truth. When identity becomes script dependent, moments without narrative framing begin to feel empty. Spontaneity feels awkward. Silence feels undefined. Experiences that don't fit a recognizable arc are dismissed as meaningless. The self becomes something that must be performed even internally. At this stage, the individual still believes they are choosing, but their choices are increasingly constrained by narrative logic. They're not asking who they are, they're asking which version makes sense. Parasocial identity scripts do not replace self overthought, they slow its development. They delay self recognition. They encourage the mind to wait for clarity, for context, for a story that explains who it should be. And in that waiting, something important happens. The self stops leading and it starts following. Following patterns, following archetypes, following the emotional gravity of stories that already know how a life is supposed to feel. That is the quiet shift, not the loss of choice, but the narrowing of what feels possible. Before we continue, a quick heads up. If you can, take a moment to pause and reset. The topics from this point onwards are complex and deal with mature existential themes that may be overwhelming for some viewers. Ethical retrogenesis is the process by which moral reasoning does not evolve forward but instead regresses, shifting from intuitive empathy based on judgment to rigid, narrative driven justification. It is not the loss of morality, it is the loss of moral questioning. We often assume that ethics naturally progress, that exposure to knowledge, culture, and stories makes us more nuanced and humane. But developmental psychology suggests something less comforting. Under certain conditions, moral reasoning can revert to earlier, more primitive structures. In The Moral Judgment of the Child, Jean Piaget observed that when individuals rely heavily on external rules or authority, moral reasoning becomes rigid. Actions are judged not by harm or empathy, but by compliance and coherence. Right or wrong stop being felt and start being calculated. Later, Lawrence Kohlberg, in his Stages of Moral Development, identified a similar vulnerability. When morality becomes dependent on systems, rules, or outcomes, it can stagnate or collapse inwards. The individual follows rules not because they are right, but because they make sense within a framework. Stories rarely ask us to sit with moral uncertainty, they resolve it. Actions are justified by context. Harm is framed as necessary. Consequences are narratively meaningful. Over time, this structure trains the mind to evaluate morality through internal consistency rather than ethical intuition. The question quietly changes. Not is this right, but does this fit? In Eichmann in Journalism, Hannah Arendt described what she famously called the vanity of evil. Evil in her eyes was not driven by cruelty or hatred, but by unexamined adherence to a system that felt logical and justified. Moral failure was procedural, not emotional. Ethical retrogenesis follows the same pattern. The individual does not become immoral, they become certain. Moral discomfort is reframed as immaturity. Doubt becomes weakness. Empathy is dismissed when it conflicts with a clean explanation. The narrative supplies answers faster than reflection ever could. In The Lucifer Effect, Philip Zimbardo demonstrated how ordinary people placed within coherent narrative roles can commit acts that violate their own moral intuitions, not because they wanted to, but because the structure made those acts feel justified. Fiction provides those structures effortlessly. It divides the world into protagonists and obstacles. It explains suffering. It offers closure, and closure feels ethical. As ethical retrogenesis deepens, morality shifts from empathy to explanation. Harm is tolerated if it leads somewhere meaningful. Responsibility is displaced into context, necessity, and inevitability. At this stage, fiction is no longer influencing what we believe, it is reshaping how belief itself is formed. The most dangerous moral failures are not born from chaos, but they are born from coherence. If ethical retrogenesis alters how we judge, reality retrogenesis alters what we trust. Reality retrogenesis is the gradual regression of the mind's ability to process, stabilize, or rely on reality as a consistent reference point. It is not delusion, it is not psychosis, and it is not rejection of reality. It is something subtler. Reality is still perceived, but it is no longer authoritative. We assume that reality corrects itself, that when beliefs drift too far, experiences intervene. But perception is not a passive recording device, it is an interpretive system, shaped by expectation, memory, and prior structure. Immanuel Kant argued that we never encounter reality directly, only reality as filtered through cognitive categories. What we perceive is already organized before it reaches awareness. Fiction exploits this vulnerability. When narratives are repeated often enough, especially ones that are emotionally charged, coherent, or internally complete, they begin to function as perpetual priors. They don't replace reality, they precede it. The mind starts comparing experiences not to the world but to expectations. In The Social Construction of Reality, Peter L. Berger and Thomas Luckman describe how shared narratives stabilize reality itself. Meaning is not discovered, it is maintained through repetition and reinforcement. When those narratives shift, reality shifts with them. Reality retrogenesis occurs when this process becomes internalized. The individual no longer asks what is happening, they ask what does this resemble. Experience feels real only when it fits a recognizable narrative. Ambiguity becomes intolerable. Contradictions are smoothed over, not because they are resolved, but because they disrupt coherence. Reality begins to require interpretation before it can be trusted. This is not confusion, this is overcoherence. Jean Baudrillard warned that representation can become more real than reality, that the map can precede its territory. Reality retrogenesis is the psychological version of that collapse. Fictional frameworks become the dominant reference. The perception of reality quietly fragments between lived experience and narrative expectations. The result is not emotional instability, it is epistemic instability. In Being and Nothingness, Jean-Paul Sartre argued that meaning is imposed by consciousness. When meaning becomes prescribed, experience starts to feel hollow, staged, or distant. People report the world feeling off, not unreal, just misaligned. Familiar places feel flat, new experiences feel strangely predictable. The mind compensates by leaning harder on interpretation. News becomes narrative, memory becomes selective, perception becomes symbolic. What matters is no longer whether something is true, but whether it fits. Reality retrogenesis does not erase reality, it corrodes confidence in it. And when that confidence weakens, reality stops being the foundation. It becomes raw material, something to be processed, arranged, and made to make sense. The danger is not that reality disappears, it is that it becomes optional. What follows is not persuasion, belief change, or ideological alignment. It is a reconstructing of the cognitive schemas that govern how identity, morality, meaning, and reality itself are processed. Schemas are not opinions, they are not values. They are the frameworks that decide which opinions and values can exist. In cognitive psychology, schemas are understood as deep mental structures that organize perception, interpretation, and response. Gene Mandler describes them as resistant to change once stabilized because they operate below conscious reasoning. They do not ask for permission, they execute. Schema-level cultivation occurs when repeated narratives stop being processed as content and begin functioning as infrastructure. The mind no longer encounters them as stories, it uses them as defaults. This is the terminal stage. To understand how this happens, we have to look backward, mechanically, not conceptually. It begins with phobic micro-induction. Fear becomes efficient, not as panic, but as anticipation. Threat perception shifts from reactive to predictive. Vigilance feels wise. Safety feels provisional. The emotional system remains active even in the absence of threat. From this, parasocial identity scripts take hold. Stable functional identities offer relief. Characters are coherent, motivations are clear, arcs resolve. The mind begins referencing these identities, not to imitate them, but to organize itself. Identity formation slows. Self-authorship is delayed. Agency is not lost, it is deferred. Next comes ethical retrogenesis. When identity is scaffolded by narrative logic, morality follows. Ethical judgment shifts from intuition to coherence. Actions are evaluated not by harm or empathy, but by whether they make sense within a framework. Moral certainty replaces moral reflection. As Hannah Arendt observed, this requires no cruelty, only compliance with the system that feels justified. Ethics are no longer negotiated internally, they are resolved procedurally. Then, reality retrogenesis completes the destabilization. When emotion, fear, identity, and morality are all structured narratively, reality itself loses authority. Experience is no longer trusted unless it fits expectations. Ambiguity becomes intolerable. Meaning must be assigned immediately. As Jean Baudrillard warned, representation begins to precede reality. The model dictates perception. Reality becomes raw input. This is the final precondition. Once these systems align, the mind no longer requires active belief to function within a framework. The framework itself is already in place. This is schema-level cultivation. At this stage, the individual does not hold a worldview, they are operating inside one. As Thomas Kuhn described, paradigms determine not only answers, but which questions are even intelligible. Alternatives do not feel threatening, they feel nonsensical. Cognition shifts from deliberation to execution. As Daniel Kahneman explains, most mental activity is automatic. The mind responds before it reflects. Contradiction triggers discomfort, not inquiry. The system is no longer an object of belief, it is the environment. The most dangerous aspect of this stage is not control, it is completion. There is no sense of loss, no collapse of self. What disappears is friction, doubt, ambiguity, internal resistance. The old operating system is not destroyed, it is deprecated. As Erich Fromm warned, people often surrender autonomy not under force but in exchange for relief. Relief from uncertainty, responsibility, and choice. Schema-level cultivation offers that relief silently. Once complete, everything feels clear. Meaning feels stable, identity feels settled, reality feels obvious, questions feel inefficient. Nothing feels wrong. And systems that no longer experience friction do not adapt, they persist. Throughout this series, fiction seemed external, a mirror, a tool, a harmless abstraction. But the truth is quieter and far more unsettling. Fiction does not need belief, it does not need agreement, it only needs repetition. Expectation shapes fear, fear seeks structure, structure offers identity, identity demands justification, and justification reframes reality. There is no moment where this announces itself, no clear line where fiction replaces reality. The shift is gradual, procedural, and comfortable. By the time it's complete, nothing feels wrong. This is the danger, not deception, but coherence without friction. When meaning feels settled, inquiry feels unnecessary. When identity feels complete, doubt feels like an error. And systems that stop questioning do not wake up, they persist. So if this felt familiar, if it felt uncomfortably precise, that discomfort isn't misunderstanding, it's resistance. Hold on to it. But just remember, this is not real, it's just a dream. Please, please, wake up, wake up, wake up. After what? More than one whole year of pure health porn? I'm done with this series. But hey, I learned quite a lot throughout this journey that I felt had to be the case with you people too. By the way, if you haven't watched the previous two parts, do one thing. Watch both of them in order, then watch this again. Since the order makes it easier to understand and digest the topics. Click here to watch them. But in the end, just know that if it feels like a challenge, it's worth challenging. Thank you for watching.